Karen thought her clipboard gave her power, but one pool proved she never had control at all. The neighborhood had always seemed perfect at first glance. Rows of identical houses sat neatly side by side, trimmed hedges lined the streets, and freshly painted fences marked the invisible borders of pride and conformity. It looked like the kind of community where peace reigned, where everyone followed the rules, and where problems never existed. But behind that postcard image lurked a shadow that ruled every home, every lawn, and every family. That shadow was the HOA, and at the heart of it stood one woman, Karen. To outsiders, she was just another resident, but anyone who lived within those strict borders knew she was the self-proclaimed queen of the community. Armed with a clipboard and a voice sharp enough to cut through any excuse, she became the enforcer of every rule, real or imagined. She walked the sidewalks with authority, jotting notes, snapping pictures, and leaving warnings on doors as though she were policing a kingdom that belonged only to her. For years, neighbors obeyed. They trimmed their grass to her standard, painted their shutters within her approved palette, and parked their cars according to her dictates. Some feared her fines, others simply didn't want the drama. Karen thrived on that fear. She wasn't just following the HOA's rulebook, she was rewriting it, bending it, and using it as a weapon. Most bent under her pressure. But I wasn't most. When I moved in, I thought I could blend quietly into the community. My plan was simple: work, take care of my family, and finally live the life I had dreamed of. But dreams, in neighborhoods like this, were often seen as threats. My dream was not extravagant, it was a pool. A simple pool in the backyard where my family could gather, children could laugh, and long summer nights could be filled with joy. But in Karen's eyes, it was rebellion. The idea began harmlessly enough. I applied for the required permits, hired a contractor, and prepared my yard for the transformation. That's when Karen struck. She arrived at the HOA meeting with her ever-present binder, flipping through pages like a general drawing her sword. She declared pools were not aesthetic, claimed they would lower property values, and warned of noise that would ruin community harmony. Her words carried weight, not because they were true, but because no one dared challenge her. The HOA board, a group of individuals who often looked more intimidated than authoritative, shifted in their seats. They didn't support her claims outright, but neither did they oppose her. That was Karen's power: intimidation, persistence, and the unspoken fear of becoming her next target. For most, it was easier to stay silent. But I wasn't ready to surrender. The weeks that followed felt like a chess game, and Karen was determined to win. She posted notices on my door, filled with exaggerated claims and obscure citations. She sent me letters highlighted in neon colors, quoting rules that didn't exist. She walked past my house daily, taking photographs, sometimes even standing long enough to ensure I saw her. To her, this wasn't about a pool, it was about control. If she let me succeed, others might think they could too, and her empire of fear would crumble. But the ground broke anyway. The contractors arrived, the machines hummed, and little by little, the earth gave way to the shape of my dream. My yard, once plain, now echoed with the sound of determination. And as the foundation deepened, Karen's anger grew. She ramped up her efforts, filing complaints with the board, spreading whispers among neighbors, and attempting to rally support against me. It was then that the community began to divide. Some neighbors, weary of her constant interference, quietly encouraged me. They admired my stand but dared not say much in public. Others, still caught in her orbit of influence, avoided me, afraid they might be marked next. And the HOA board? They wavered. Their loyalty to Karen's voice was weakening, but they still hadn't found the courage to break free. The day water filled the pool was the day Karen lost her grip on subtlety. The blue shimmer of sunlight on water seemed to mock her. She stormed down the sidewalk, phone in hand, snapping pictures from every angle. She muttered to anyone within earshot about community violations and safety hazards. When her letters didn't work, she threatened daily fines. When fines didn't work, she escalated to demands for demolition. But with every move, her desperation showed more clearly. What Karen didn't realize was that the pool had already shifted the balance of power. Neighbors began to see her not as a protector of community standards, but as an enforcer of her own ego. The more she fought, the more people questioned why. Why was she so determined to crush one family's joy? Why was a pool such a threat? And why had they all allowed her to rule unchallenged for so long? The tension built like a storm cloud. The HOA meetings grew louder, more divided, with voices rising against Karen's endless crusade. For the first time, the board questioned her reasoning openly. For the first time, neighbors muttered their disapproval within her earshot. And for the first time, Karen's voice, once absolute, began to tremble with frustration. But if I thought the battle would end with water filling my pool, I was wrong. Because Karen wasn't just angry, she was cornered. And cornered people don't back down quietly. They fight harder, louder, and more recklessly than ever before. And that was exactly what Karen was about to do. As the sun set over the glittering water in my backyard, I realized my pool wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a challenge, a symbol, a crack in the foundation of the HOA's control. And that crack was about to spread into something much larger. The real war hadn't even begun. Karen thought she could bury me under fines, but instead she buried the HOA in chaos. When the pool was finished, Karen didn't see it as water, she saw it as rebellion. And she was determined to drown me in rules. The pool stood like a jewel in the middle of my backyard, shimmering under the sunlight, a picture of joy and freedom. But to Karen, it wasn't beauty, it was betrayal. She saw it as the one thing she had sworn would never exist, a challenge that had slipped past her control. And if there was one thing Karen could not tolerate, it was losing control. The morning after the water was poured in, a letter appeared on my front door. It wasn't just a warning this time, it was a threat. The HOA, in Karen's words, was demanding daily fines until the illegal structure was removed. The fines weren't small either. They grew each day like a snowball rolling downhill, meant to crush me under their weight. But the problem was, the rules didn't back her up. The HOA's own documents were vague, and nowhere did it state that pools were forbidden. Yet Karen pressed forward, insisting her interpretation was law. The board, as usual, wavered. They listened to her arguments, nodded to her passion, but hesitated to enforce anything concrete. It was clear to everyone that Karen's authority didn't come from the rulebook, it came from fear. But fear only lasts until someone refuses to bow to it. And with my pool glistening as proof of defiance, more and more neighbors began to wonder if Karen's rule had gone too far. That was when Karen shifted tactics. If fines didn't work, she would use shame. She called for an emergency HOA meeting and invited the entire community. She wanted to make an example of me. The meeting hall buzzed with uneasy energy as neighbors filled the seats. Karen stood at the front, binder in hand, her voice sharp and commanding as she laid out her accusations. She called the pool a nuisance, safety hazard, and an unauthorized structure. She waved photographs like evidence in a courtroom, pointing to the blue water as if it were a crime scene. But something was different this time. The room didn't echo with agreement. It hummed with murmurs, whispers of doubt, and sideways glances. People weren't nodding as quickly as before. They were questioning. And when a neighbor in the back raised his hand and asked why the rulebook didn't mention pools, Karen snapped. Her face flushed, her voice sharpened, and she launched into an angry tirade about community standards and maintaining order. It was a mask slipping and everyone saw it. After that night, the neighborhood changed. Some neighbors, emboldened by her outburst, began to talk more openly. They spoke of fines they had endured for trivial things. Mailboxes painted too dark, trash cans left out for an hour, even flowers the wrong shade of pink. Stories spread like wildfire, and with each one, Karen's grip loosened. What was once seen as her strength was now seen as her tyranny. But Karen wasn't finished. If the community wouldn't support her, she would escalate on her own. She filed reports with city offices, claiming my pool was a hazard. Inspectors arrived, checked everything, and left with nothing to support her claims. She tried contacting zoning departments, safety officials, even local police. Each time, her efforts fell flat. But instead of admitting defeat, she grew more determined, more unhinged. Her morning walks became surveillance runs, her clipboard filled with photographs and notes. My backyard became her obsession. And the more she obsessed, the more she alienated everyone else. The board grew frustrated with her endless demands. Neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, some openly rolling their eyes when she walked by. For the first time, her authority wasn't just questioned, it was mocked. That's when the cracks in the HOA itself began to show. At the next board meeting, the discussion turned against her. Members who had once quietly supported her now spoke up, asking why she was wasting so much energy on one pool. Why fines were being threatened without proper justification. Why the HOA's focus had shifted from community improvement to Karen's personal crusade. Her responses grew sharper, her voice louder, her arguments thinner. The empire she had built with intimidation was collapsing from the inside. And yet, Karen still refused to back down. Her final weapon was desperation. She went door to door, pleading with neighbors, telling them that if my pool remained, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. She painted pictures of noisy parties, dangerous accidents, property values plummeting. But her words no longer carried the weight they once did. Instead of fear, she found resistance. Instead of obedience, she met defiance. People had grown tired of her reign, and the pool had given them something to rally around. The more she fought, the more she exposed herself. And the more she exposed herself, the weaker her grip became. By the end of that summer, the neighborhood was no longer united in silence. It was divided, restless, and simmering with frustration. The HOA, once a fortress of control, was cracking under the pressure of Karen's obsession. And though she didn't know it yet, she wasn't just fighting me anymore, she was fighting the entire community. The war she had started over one backyard pool was about to bring down everything she had built. And the climax of that war was closer than anyone realized. They thought they had the power. They thought their rules were unshakable. But when one pool brought an entire HOA to its knees, everything they believed in crumbled before their eyes. This was no longer about water in a backyard. It was about freedom, pride, and exposing the truth. And Karen? Well, she never saw her empire collapse so fast. The story had reached its boiling point. The pool was finished, gleaming under the summer sun like a jewel that represented rebellion. Neighbors gathered around, whispering, pointing, and quietly cheering as they saw what had once been forbidden now standing tall and undeniable. For the first time, the fear of HOA fines and letters seemed to vanish. People realized that the so-called rules that Karen had enforced for years were nothing more than threats, shaky in foundation, and powerless when challenged with real strength. Karen, however, was far from ready to surrender. She stormed through the neighborhood like a queen whose crown had been stolen, ranting about violations, threatening lawsuits, and even going as far as calling in city inspectors to shut everything down. But this time, the cracks in her authority showed. Inspectors reviewed the pool, measured it, checked the permits, and found everything in order. Legally, there was nothing wrong. Every box had been ticked, every regulation followed, and every attempt she made to dismantle it ended in embarrassment. Her fury only grew when neighbors began to ask questions out loud. If she had lied about the pool rules, what else had she twisted to her advantage? Were all the fines, all the warnings, all the restrictions she had pushed for years even legitimate? Whispers turned to conversations, and conversations turned to open rebellion. Families who had once stayed quiet began pulling out their old HOA letters, noticing how Karen had used fear to control them. One by one, they started to push back. The HOA board itself began to fracture. Members who had once stood firmly behind Karen started distancing themselves, realizing that her obsession with power had gone too far. In secret meetings, they discussed removing her as president. The same authority she had wielded like a weapon now hung by a thread, slipping out of her grasp. And then came the breaking moment. At the next HOA gathering, held in the community center, Karen tried to rally support one last time. She pointed at me, accusing, ranting about the pool as though it were the end of civilization itself. But this time, the crowd didn't nod in silence. They shouted back. They demanded answers. They asked her where their money had gone, why their community fund was nearly empty, and why she had enforced rules that weren't even in the HOA charter. The truth spilled out like a dam breaking. Financial records, hidden emails, and testimonies from former board members revealed that Karen had been misusing HOA funds, charging residents for violations that didn't exist, and funneling money into her own projects. The room turned against her in an instant. The woman who had once controlled every lawn, every paint color, and every backyard suddenly found herself cornered, powerless, and exposed. The board voted. Karen was removed from her position, stripped of authority, and left to face possible legal consequences for her actions. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. The grip of fear had been broken, and the symbol of that freedom shimmered under the sun: my pool. What started as a personal dream had turned into a movement. Families began renovating their homes without fear, children played freely, and the community thrived again. The HOA didn't vanish completely, but its power was rebalanced, rebuilt to serve rather than to control. And the story of how one pool toppled the reign of Karen became legend in our neighborhood. As for Karen, she faded into the background, her once dominant voice reduced to whispers. The clipboard was gone, the fines forgotten, and the queen of control had finally lost her crown. And so, what began as a battle over water ended as a victory for freedom. The pool wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had lived under Karen's shadow. It was proof that sometimes, standing up to power doesn't just change your life. It changes an entire community. And that, my friends, is how Karen told me I couldn't have a pool, so I built one that broke the HOA. If you love this story and want to hear more wild HOA and Karen dramas, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with someone who needs to know that standing up for yourself is always worth it. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.